Montana Territory, 1878. The merciless August sun beat down on Bitterroot's auction square like a hammer on anvil, casting harsh shadows across the weathered wooden platform, where human lives were being sold like cattle. Kael Windwalker stood motionless at the edge of the crowd, his weathered Shoshone features carved from stone, but his dark eyes burned with an intensity that made nearby settlers step aside. At 48, exile had carved deep lines around those eyes, and his long black hair, streaked with premature silver, hung loose except for the single eagle feather that marked his warrior status among his people. His right hand rested on the worn, leather grip of his hunting knife, fingers unconsciously tracing the carved bone handle as he watched the scene unfold with growing horror. On the platform, Brennan stood with her 4 daughters, their faces streaked with tears and dust. The youngest 5-year-old Wren clung to her mother's torn skirt, while 8-year-old Ivy buried her face against Lila's shoulder. 10-year-old Sarah stood protective beside 12-year-old Ilara, whose green eyes blazed with defiance even as shackles bit into her wrists. Lila herself, though only 32, looked aged beyond her years, her auburn hair matted and her once fine dress reduced to rags. But it was her eyes that caught Kael's attention, the way they darted nervously through the crowd, searching until they locked with his for one electric moment. In that instant, he saw her hand move to her bodice, pressing something small and metallic hidden there, her fingers trembling as she quickly looked away. The auctioneer, a sweating man in a stained vest, called out bids with the enthusiasm of a livestock dealer. "Fine specimens here, folks. Strong backs good for kitchen work and—" His voice trailed off as the crowd's attention shifted to the imposing figure stepping onto the platform. Vance Heler commanded attention wherever he went, his 6-foot frame draped in an expensive black suit that seemed untouched by the dust that covered everything else in Montana Territory. His silver hair was slicked back, revealing a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel intelligence in his pale blue eyes, and the jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from some long-ago violence. Kael's hand tightened instinctively on his knife handle as Heler's gaze swept the platform, lingering on each of the girls with a predatory assessment that made bile rise in the warrior's throat. There was something in Heler's expression, a look of satisfaction mixed with dark anticipation, that spoke of plans extending far beyond a simple slave purchase. When Heler's eyes met Lila's, Kael caught something else, a flicker of recognition and fear that passed between them like lightning. Lila's breathing quickened her hand, pressing harder against whatever she hid in her bodice. And in that moment, Kael knew with warrior's instinct that these people shared a history written in blood and secrets. "I'll take the lot." Heler announced, his voice carrying easily across the square. $500. The crowd murmured in surprise at the generous offer, but Kael saw the way Heler's lips curved in a smile that never reached his eyes, saw how his scarred fingers drummed against his thigh in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained excitement. This wasn't business, Kael realized with growing unease. This was something personal, something that had been planned and anticipated. Without conscious thought, Kael stepped forward, his moccasins silent on the sun-baked earth. 1,000. He called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. Every head turned toward him, and he felt the familiar weight of hostile stares from the white settlers who saw him as nothing more than a savage in their midst. But he kept his eyes fixed on Heler, watching as the man's expression shifted from surprise to cold calculation. Heler studied Kael for a long moment, taking in the worn buckskins, the eagle feather, the proud bearing that no amount of exile had managed to break. 1,100. He countered, his voice carrying a note of amusement that set Kael's teeth on edge. There was something in the way Heler looked at him, a recognition that went beyond their current confrontation, as if he was seeing not just a rival bidder, but a long-awaited opponent in some game whose rules only he understood. Kael reached into his leather pouch and withdrew his most precious possession, and the gold ring that had belonged to his mother, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. The ring caught the sunlight, its simple beauty, a stark contrast to the sordid scene playing out around it. 1,500, he said, holding the ring high so all could see. Gold, pure Dakota gold. The crowd gasped at the sight of such wealth from an Indian. But Kael ignored their whispers, his attention focused entirely on Heler. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Heler's features, but it was quickly replaced by something far more dangerous. His eyes narrowed as he studied the ring, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of malice that made several nearby settlers step back. That's a fine piece of jewelry, Chief. Reminds me of another ring I once saw, one worn by a certain Shoshone woman who thought she could protect her son from the inevitable. The words hit Kael like physical blows, and his hand moved instinctively to his knife. But gold can't buy everything, can it? Sometimes the past comes calling, and all the treasure in the world can't change what's already been written in blood. The auctioneer, sensing the tension crackling between the two men like summer lightning, quickly called for any other bids. When none came, he brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold to the Indian for 1,500 in gold. Kael stepped forward, his movements fluid and controlled despite the rage building in his chest. He placed his mother's ring in the auctioneer's sweaty palm, then turned to face the platform where Lila and her daughters waited. Drawing his knife in one smooth motion, Kael leaped onto the platform and began sawing through the rope bonds that held the family. The blade moved with practiced efficiency, parting the fibers as if they were gossamer. "You're free," he said simply, his voice pitched low so only they could hear. "All of you." But even as he spoke the words, he was aware of Heler moving closer, and the man's presence a shadow of menace that seemed to drain warmth from the air. "Touching," Heler said, his voice dripping with false sentiment. "But I'm afraid freedom isn't something you can just purchase, Chief. You see, Mrs. Brennan and I have unfinished business, don't we, sister?" The last word fell like a stone into still water, and Kael saw Lila flinch as if struck. Business that goes back to a certain fire that claimed her dear husband and a certain key that went missing around the same time. Lila's face went white as parchment, her hand flying to her bodice, where Kael now realized she must be hiding the key Heler spoke of. "You're lying," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction, and her daughters pressed closer to her, sensing the fear that radiated from their mother like heat from a forge. "Am I?" Heller's smile was sharp as broken glass. Poor Thomas dying in that terrible accident just weeks after he refused to sell his land to the railroad. And that key to his private safe, the one that held all those inconvenient documents about mineral rights and territory boundaries, vanishing without a trace. Quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say? Kael finished cutting the last rope and helped Elara to her feet, the girl's eyes wide with terror as she looked between her mother and the man who spoke with such casual cruelty about her father's death. "We need to go," Kael said urgently, but Heler raised his hand, and suddenly men were stepping out of the crowd, their coats falling open to reveal the gun butts beneath. "Oh, I don't think so," Heler said conversationally. "You see, Chief, you've just interfered with a family reunion. And in Montana territory, we don't take kindly to Indians who don't know their place." He gestured slightly, and his men began to close in their hands, resting on their weapons. "I think it's time you learned what happens to savages who try to play at being civilized." The crowd was beginning to back away, sensing violence in the air, like the metallic taste that preceded a storm. Kael positioned himself between Heller's men and the family, his knife held low and ready. "Leave them be," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief, despite his exile. "Your quarrel is with me now." "My quarrel?" Heler laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Chief, you have no idea how long I've been looking forward to this moment. You think this is about some auction? This goes back much further than you know. Back to a time when your people thought they could stand against progress, against destiny itself." His eyes glittered with malicious joy. "Your mother thought the same thing, didn't she, right up until the end?" Rage surged through Kael like a prairie fire. But he forced himself to remain calm, to think like the warrior his people had trained him to be, rather than the angry son who wanted nothing more than to bury his blade in this monster's heart. "Run," he whispered to Lila without taking his eyes off Heler. "Take your daughters and run, now." But before anyone could move, chaos erupted as Heler's men drew their guns and the crowd scattered screaming. Kael threw himself forward, tackling two of the gunmen as their weapons cleared leather. His knife found flesh, opening a red line across one man's gun arm, but there were too many of them. A gunshot cracked across the square, and Kael felt the bullet tug at his hair as he rolled away from grasping hands. Behind him, he heard Lila scream as more men closed in on her family. Alara grabbed a piece of broken wood from the platform and swung it wildly, her face fierce with protective fury, while little Wren clung to her mother's skirts and sobbed. "The livery stable!" Kael shouted over the din. "Go to McKinnon's stable." He hoped the old Scotsman would help them, prayed that not every white man in Bitterroot had been bought by Heler's influence. A meaty fist connected with Kael's temple, sending stars exploding across his vision. But he rolled with the blow and came up with his knife leading. The blade opened another man's side, and suddenly he had room to breathe. In the distance, he could see Lila leading her daughters away from the square, Alara looking back once with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, something that spoke of bonds being forged in the crucible of shared danger. Heler stood in the center of the chaos like the eye of a hurricane, his pale eyes following Lila's retreat with the intensity of a predator tracking wounded prey. "Let them go," he called to his men, his voice carrying easily over the sounds of combat. "For now. After all, where can they run that we won't find them? Montana Territory is a big place, but it's not that big." Kael backed toward the edge of the square, his knife weaving patterns in the air that kept Heler's remaining men at bay. Blood ran from a cut above his left eye, and his ribs ached where a gun butt had caught him. But he was still standing still, dangerous. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes locked with Heler's across the ruined square. "Oh, I'm counting on it," Heler replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been polite, if not for the venomous smile that accompanied it. "After all, Chief, you've got something that belongs to me. And I've got something that belongs to you. I think it's time we discussed an exchange, don't you?" But Kael was already moving, melting into the shadows between buildings with the fluid grace that had made his people such effective warriors. Behind him, Heler's laughter followed like the echo of distant thunder, a sound that promised storms yet to come. McKinnon's livery stable squatted at the edge of town like a weathered giant, its wooden walls darkened by years of smoke and dust. Kael found Lila and her daughters huddled in one of the back stalls, Alara standing guard with a pitchfork, while her younger sisters clustered around their mother. The old Scotsman himself was nowhere to be seen, but his absence spoke volumes about the reach of Heler's influence in Bitterroot. "We can't stay here," Kael said without preamble, checking the cuts on his arms and finding them manageable. "Heler will search every building in town before the sun sets." He studied Lila's face, noting the way her hand still pressed against her bodice, where the mysterious key lay hidden. "We need to talk. About your brother, about what he wants, and about what really happened to your husband." Lila's composure finally cracked, and she sank to her knees in the hay, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she whispered. "I just wanted to protect them, to give them a chance at a normal life. But Vance, Vance never forgives, never forgets. Heler knelt beside her mother, her young face grave with understanding beyond her years. "What key is he talking about, Mama? What did Papa hide from us?" There was no accusation in her voice, only the steady determination of a girl forced to grow up too fast in a world that showed children no mercy. Kael settled cross-legged in the hay, his warrior's patience allowing him to wait while Lilah gathered herself. Outside, he could hear the sounds of men moving through the streets, their voices calling back and forth as they conducted their search. Time was running short, but rushing would only lead to mistakes, and in their situation, mistakes meant death. Thomas found something. Lilah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. In the hills east of town, a survey map that showed the real mineral deposits, the ones the railroad company claimed didn't exist when they were buying up land for nothing. He was going to expose them, going to show everyone how they'd been cheated. She pulled the small brass key from her bodice, its surface tarnished, but its shape still clear. This opens his private safe in Billings. All the evidence is there, everything needed to prove what they did. And Heler killed him for it. Kael said the words a statement rather than a question. He'd seen enough violence in his 48 years to recognize the patterns, the way powerful men removed obstacles with casual brutality. The fire wasn't an accident. Lilah confirmed, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the truth aloud for the first time. Vance came to see Thomas the night before, tried to buy him off. When Thomas refused, she shuddered, pulling Wren closer. I heard them arguing, heard Vance threaten him. But I was a coward. I didn't warn him, didn't think Vance would actually. Her voice trailed off, but the guilt in her eyes finished the sentence. Alara's hand found her mother's, squeezing gently. You couldn't have known, Mama. Uncle Vance always seemed so civilized, so proper. Who would have thought? She looked up at Kael, her green eyes serious. What do we do now? He'll never stop hunting us, will he? Kael considered the question, weighing their options against the realities of their situation. 3 days hard riding would get them to Billings, but Heler's men would be watching the roads. The key represented justice, but only if they could live long enough to use it. There's another way, he said finally. Through the Bitterroot Mountains. It's dangerous, especially with winter coming, but my people use those trails for generations. Heler's men won't know them. Not my people, Lilah repeated softly. But you're alone now, aren't you, exiled from your tribe for showing mercy to settlers? There was no judgment in her voice, only understanding, the recognition of one outcast speaking to another. The words stung because they were true, but Kael had learned to live with that particular pain. I chose to save lives rather than take them, he said simply. My war chief saw it as weakness. But my mother taught me that protecting the innocent was the highest calling of a warrior, even if the innocent wear a different color skin. Outside, the search was growing closer, voices becoming more distinct as Heler's men worked their way through the buildings. Kael rose smoothly to his feet, checking his weapons and gear with practiced efficiency. We need horses, he said, and supplies for the mountain crossing. Can you ride? All of us can. Heler answered for her family. Papa taught us, said a frontier woman needed to be ready for anything. Pride colored her voice when she spoke of her father, and Kael recognized the fierce loyalty that would make her a formidable ally in the trials ahead. The sound of boots on wooden planks froze them all in place. Someone was entering the stable, their steps cautious but determined. Kael drew his knife silently, positioning himself between the family and the stall entrance. A shadow fell across the doorway, and then Dr. Benjamin Brennan stepped into view, his medical bag clutched in one trembling hand. Lilah, he called softly. Are you here? I've been looking everywhere. He caught sight of Kael, and stopped abruptly, his eyes going wide with fear. "Please, I'm not armed. I just want to help." Lila rose slowly, her expression unreadable. "Ben, what are you doing here? It's dangerous. Vance's men are everywhere." There was something in her voice, a note of caution that made Kael's warrior instincts prickle with warning. Dr. Brennan stepped closer, his movements jerky with nervous energy. "I heard what happened at the auction. Dear God, Lila, when I think what could have happened." He seemed to notice the children for the first time, his gaze lingering on each of them with an expression that might have been paternal concern. "Are they hurt? Do they need medical attention?" "We're fine," Alara said firmly, moving to stand beside Kael. Something in the doctor's manner had set her on edge as well, though she couldn't have said exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the way his eyes kept darting to the stable entrance, or the fact that his medical bag seemed unusually heavy for a simple house call. Kael studied the doctor carefully, noting details that spoke to his warrior training. The man's boots were too clean for someone who had supposedly been searching through the dusty streets of Bitterroot. His hands shook, but not with the tremor of age or illness, rather, with the nervous energy of someone under great stress. Most telling of all, there was a bulge beneath his coat that suggested a weapon poorly concealed. "Dr. Brennan." Kael said carefully, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "How did you know we were here? McKinnon's stable isn't exactly the first place someone would look for refugees." The doctor's face flushed, and he took another step closer to Lila. I asked around. People saw you heading this way, after the trouble at the square." His explanation was reasonable, but something in his tone rang false. "Lila, you have to listen to me. Vance is offering a substantial reward for information about your whereabouts. The whole town is looking for you. And yet, you found us first." Kael observed his hand shifting almost imperceptibly toward his knife. "That's quite fortunate, don't you think?" Dr. Brennan's medical bag hit the ground with a metallic clank that spoke of more than just surgical instruments. His right hand moved toward his coat, but Kael was already in motion, crossing the distance between them in 2 swift strides. His left hand clamped down on the doctor's wrist, while his right brought the knife up to rest against the man's throat. Slowly. Kael said, his voice deadly calm, "Show me what you have under that coat. And doctor, I've killed men for less than betraying a family in need, so please don't test my patience." With shaking fingers, Dr. Brennan pulled back his coat to reveal a small derringer tucked into his belt. But it was the object in his other hand that made Lila gasp with recognition, a small silver locket that she hadn't seen in years. "My mother's locket," she whispered. "I thought it was lost in the fire." Her eyes fixed on the doctor with growing understanding and horror. "You were there that night. You helped him, didn't you? You helped Vance murder my husband." Dr. Brennan's shoulders sagged as the weight of his guilt settled upon him like a shroud. He said it would be quick, painless. Just a little laudanum in Thomas's evening whiskey, enough to make him sleep through what came after. I never meant for it to go so far, but Vance, he has a way of making people do things, making them believe they have no choice. Alara stepped forward, her young face twisted with rage. "You murdered my father. You sat at our table, ate our food, pretended to be our friend, and all the while, you were planning his death." Her hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Kael thought she might attack the doctor despite the knife at his throat. "I tried to save him," Dr. Brennan protested weakly. "When I realized what Vance really intended, I tried to warn Thomas, but it was too late. The fire had already started, and..." He closed his eyes, unable to meet their accusing stares. "I've been living with the guilt ever since. That's why I'm here now, why I want to help. To make amends. By leading Heler's men straight to us. Kael's voice could have cut glass. How many pieces of silver did he pay you, Doctor? What was the price for a family's lives? The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the tense silence like thunder. Through the gaps in the stable walls, Kael could see riders surrounding the building, their weapons drawn and ready. Dr. Brennan had indeed led them straight into a trap, just as Kael had suspected from the moment the man appeared. "I'm sorry." Dr. Brennan whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I tried to refuse, but he has evidence of my involvement in Thomas's death. If I don't cooperate, he'll see me hanged for murder." "You already are a murderer," Lila said quietly, her voice carrying a finality that made the doctor flinch. "The only question now is whether you'll be responsible for more deaths today." Kael's mind raced through their options, weighing possibilities against probabilities with the cold calculation of a war chief planning a desperate battle. The stable had only 2 exits, front and back, and both were undoubtedly covered by Heler's men. The walls were too thick to break through easily, and with 4 children to protect, fighting their way out would be suicide. "There's another way," he said suddenly, his eyes moving to the ladder that led to the stable's hayloft. "The roof. If we can reach the next building." He didn't finish the thought, but his meaning was clear. It was a desperate chance, but it was the only chance they had. Heler's voice boomed across the stable yard, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "Mrs. Brennan, I know you're in there. Come out now, and I promise your daughters won't be harmed. You have my word as a gentleman." Lila laughed bitterly. "A gentleman who murders his own sister's husband. Forgive me if I don't find your promises particularly reassuring, brother dear." Kael was already helping the children up the ladder, his movements swift and sure, despite the growing sounds of men positioning themselves around the stable. Alara went first, her natural agility making the climb easy, followed by Sarah and Ivy. Little Wren hesitated at the bottom, fear making her small hands shake as she reached for the rungs. "I'll be right behind you, little warrior," Kael said, gently lifting her easily to the first rung. "Your sisters are waiting, and they need you to be brave." The child nodded solemnly and began to climb, her determination touching something deep in the exiled warrior's heart. Dr. Brennan watched the escape attempt with growing agitation. "They'll kill me if you get away," he said desperately. "Vance doesn't tolerate failure, and if he thinks I helped you escape..." The fear in his voice was genuine, but it was the fear of a man who had chosen his path and now faced the consequences. "You should have thought of that before you betrayed us," Lila said as she started up the ladder. "Some choices can't be undone, Doctor. Some sins can't be forgiven." Kael was the last to climb, pausing only to grab a coil of rope from McKinnon's equipment rack. As he reached the loft, he could hear Dr. Brennan calling out to Heler's men, his voice high with panic as he explained that the fugitives were escaping through the roof. The betrayal was complete, but it had bought them precious minutes, and in a desperate situation, minutes could mean the difference between life and death. The hayloft was thick with dust and cobwebs, golden shafts of sunlight slanting through the gaps in the wooden walls. Kael moved to the small window that faced the general store next door, studying the gap between buildings with a practiced eye. It was perhaps 8 feet across, not an impossible jump for an experienced warrior, but with children and an injured woman, it would be like threading a needle in a windstorm. "Can you make it?" he asked Alara, who had positioned herself beside him at the window. The girl studied the distance with the same careful attention her father had undoubtedly taught her, weighing risks and possibilities with a maturity that both impressed and saddened the warrior. "I think so," she said finally. "But the little ones..." She didn't need to finish. Wren and Ivy would never be able to make such a jump, and even Sarah might falter at the crucial moment. Kael was already unwinding the rope, his hands working with the speed of long practice. "I'll lower them one at a time. Can you catch them on the other side?" It was asking a 12-year-old girl to take on the responsibility of an adult. But their situation had stripped away the luxury of childhood innocence. Below them, they could hear the stable doors being forced open, followed by the sound of armed men spreading through the building. Dr. Brennan's voice guided them, pointing out hiding places and explaining the layout with the thoroughness of someone intimately familiar with McKinnon's establishment. Heler nodded grimly and positioned herself at the window. Without hesitation, she swung out onto the windowsill and leaped across the gap, her arms windmilling for balance as she landed hard on the roof of the general store. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like she might slide off the far side, but her hands found purchase on the roof tiles, and she pulled herself to safety. "Ready," she called softly, positioning herself to catch whoever came next. Kael tied the rope around Wren's small waist, the child's eyes wide with terror, but her jaw set with the same determination he'd seen in her older sister. "Close your eyes, little one," he whispered. "Pretend you're a bird flying to your nest." He lowered her slowly through the window, the rope burning through his hands as he controlled her descent. Below, the sounds of the search were growing closer. Heavy boots climbed the ladder to the loft, and Kael knew they had perhaps a minute before discovery. He hauled the rope back up and quickly tied it around Ivy, the 8-year-old's face pale but resolute. Like her youngest sister, she made the crossing without crying out, though her small hands clutched the rope so tightly that her knuckles went white. Sarah went next, her 10-year-old frame making the journey with relative ease. But as Kael pulled the rope back up for Lila, the stable door below them burst open and armed men poured into the loft. Gunshots erupted, splinters exploding from the wooden walls as bullets sought their targets. "Go!" Kael shouted to Lila, pushing her toward the window, even as he drew his knife to face the men climbing toward them. "I'll hold them off." But Lila hesitated, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "You saved us," she said, her voice carrying a depth of gratitude that made his chest tighten. "Whatever happens, remember that you saved us." Then she was gone, swinging out through the window with the grace of a woman who had spent her life on the frontier. Kael didn't wait to see her land safely, turning instead to face the men who had reached the top of the ladder. His knife moved in a silver arc, opening a red line across the first attacker's gun hand, but there were too many of them, and their positions gave them every advantage. A rifle butt caught him across the temple, sending him staggering back toward the window. Stars exploded across his vision, and he felt his legs give way beneath him. As consciousness faded, he heard Heler's voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Careful with him, boys. I want the savage alive. After all, we still have so much to discuss about his dear departed mother." Darkness claimed Kael then, but his last coherent thought was a prayer to the spirits of his ancestors, that Lila and her daughters had found safety, that his sacrifice had bought them the time they needed to escape. In the distance, as if from a great depth, he thought he heard the cry of an eagle, his spirit guide calling him home. When consciousness returned, it came with the familiar weight of iron shackles around his wrists and the musty smell of a root cellar that had been converted into a makeshift prison. Kael tested the bonds carefully, feeling the solid construction that spoke of preparation and planning. This hadn't been thrown together in response to his capture. Heler had been preparing for this moment for some time. A lantern flickered in one corner, casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The cellar was beneath Heler's mansion on the hill overlooking Bitterroot, a place that had always represented power and influence in the growing settlement. Now it served as a tomb for inconvenient enemies, a place where screams would never be heard by the outside world. "Awake at last." Heler's voice came from the shadows beyond the lantern's reach. "I was beginning to worry that my men had been too enthusiastic with their rifle butts. It would have been such a disappointment to miss our little chat about old times." Kael remained silent, using the time to assess his situation and search for weaknesses in his prison. The shackles were new and well made, but the ring they were attached to was set into old wood that might be vulnerable to sustained pressure. The cellar had one entrance, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands, But the hinges were on his side of the door, a carpenter's mistake that might prove useful. Nothing to say. Heler stepped into the light, revealing a face that wore satisfaction like a mask. How disappointing. I'd hoped for some of that famous Indian stoicism, some noble speeches about honor and duty. Instead, I get sullen silence from a man whose people are too weak to even hold onto their own land. The insult was designed to provoke a response. But Kael had learned patience in the school of survival, had been taught by his mother that sometimes the greatest strength lay in knowing when not to act. He studied Heler's face instead, reading the tells that revealed the man's true emotional state. There was anticipation there and cruel joy. But underneath it all lay something else, something that looked almost like fear. Still nothing. Heler pulled a wooden chair from the corner and settled himself just outside the reach of Kael's chains. Very well, perhaps you'll be more talkative when I tell you about your dear mother. Such a noble woman, standing bare woman. So proud, so certain that her people's ancient ways could stand against the tide of progress. At the mention of his mother's name, Kael's hands clenched involuntarily, the movement setting his chains to rattling. Heler's smile widened at the response, the expression of a man who had found his opponent's weakness and intended to exploit it without mercy. Ah, there's the reaction I was looking for. Yes, I knew your mother quite well, Chief. You see, she had something I needed, something that stood in the way of a very profitable business arrangement. A treaty signed by your grandfather and witnessed by territorial officials that granted your people permanent rights to the Bitterroot Valley. Kael's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. The treaty had been lost, and the chaos that followed his people's defeat assumed destroyed when the cavalry burned their winter camp. If Heler had possessed it all these years, then the exile and suffering of the Shoshone had been based on lies, their ancestral lands stolen through murder and deception. I can see you understand. Heler continued, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that made his words all the more chilling. Your mother refused to tell me where the treaty was hidden, even when I explained how cooperation would benefit her people. Such a stubborn woman, so like my dear sister in that regard. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, now creating a picture of betrayal and greed that stretched back over decades. Heler hadn't just killed Thomas Brennan for his survey maps. He'd been systematically eliminating anyone who possessed evidence of his crimes. Anyone who could expose the web of lies that had built his fortune. She died protecting you, you know, Heler said softly. In the end, when the pain became too much, she begged me to spare her son. Such touching maternal devotion. I almost felt guilty about what happened next. Almost. Rage exploded through Kael like a prairie fire, burning away restraint and caution in its white-hot intensity. He lunged forward against his chains, the iron cutting into his wrists as he strained to reach the man who had tortured and murdered his mother. The wooden ring groaned under the sudden stress, but held firm, leaving him hanging from his shackles like a beast in a trap. There's the savage I was expecting. Heler laughed, rising from his chair and stepping well back from Kael's reach. All that careful control, all that noble bearing, and underneath it, you're nothing but an animal just like the rest of your people. It's almost a pity that you'll die before you can see what I have planned for my dear sister and her daughters. The mention of Lila and her children cut through Kael's rage like a blade of ice, replacing fury with cold calculation. If Heler was talking about future plans, that meant the family had escaped, the stable had made it to safety, despite Dr. Brennan's betrayal. The knowledge gave him strength, reminded him that his sacrifice had meaning beyond simple revenge. They got away. He said, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction. Whatever you're planning, they're beyond your reach now. Heler's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed force. Did they? Are you so certain, Chief? You see, there are only so many places a woman can hide with 4 children in Montana territory. and I have eyes and ears in all of them. Even now, my men are tracking them through the mountains, following trails that lead inevitably back to me." The words hit Kael like physical blows, but he forced himself to show no reaction. Heler might be lying, trying to break his spirit with false threats, but the man's confidence suggested otherwise. If he truly had men in pursuit, then Lila's escape had bought her only temporary safety, a brief respite before the final confrontation. "You want something from me?" Kael said, changing tactics. "Otherwise, you would have killed me already." "What is it?" Heler returned to his chair, settling back with the air of a man who held all the cards in a high-stakes game. "Very perceptive. Yes, there is something you can do for me, something that would make both our lives much simpler. You see, my dear sister has something that belongs to me, a key that opens certain doors I need opened. Convince her to return it, and I might be persuaded to let her children live." The offer was a lie, of course. Kael could see it in the man's eyes, in the way his fingers drummed against the arm of his chair with barely contained excitement. Heler had no intention of letting any of them live. They knew too much, had seen too much of his true nature to ever be allowed their freedom. But the pretense of negotiation served his purposes, allowed him to savor the anticipation of final victory. "And if I refuse?" Kael asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll watch them die one by one, starting with the youngest." Heler replied conversationally. "Little Wren, I believe her name, is such a pretty child, so innocent, so trusting. It would be a shame to see that innocence destroyed, but sometimes harsh lessons are necessary." The threat hung in the air between them like a poisonous snake, its implications clear and terrifying. Kael had faced death many times in his 48 years, had walked into battle knowing he might not return. But the thought of harm coming to those children filled him with a desperation he'd never experienced before. They'd become his responsibility the moment he'd bid on them at that cursed auction, his to protect with his life, if necessary. A commotion from somewhere above them interrupted the conversation, voices raised in alarm and the sound of running feet. Heler frowned, his attention momentarily diverted from his prisoner. "What the devil?" he muttered, rising from his chair and moving toward the cellar door. Before he could reach it, the door burst open, and Dr. Brennan stumbled down the stairs, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Vance, thank God I found you. There's been a development, something you need to know about the woman and her children." Heller's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What kind of development, Doctor? I thought I made it clear that my sister and her daughters were to be brought to me alive and unharmed. They're not running." Dr. Brennan gasped, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver his news. "Your men tracked them to the old mining camp up in the mountains, but instead of fleeing further, they've barricaded themselves in. And there's more, Vance. She sent word to the territorial authorities, told them everything about Thomas's murder and the survey maps." The color drained from Heller's face, his mask of civilized control slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "That's impossible. There's no way to get a message out from those mountains without my people intercepting it. She used the old mining equipment." Dr. Brennan explained, his voice rising with hysteria. "Jury-rigged some kind of telegraph setup using the cables they left behind. The message got through to the sheriff in Billings before anyone could stop it. He's already dispatched a federal marshal to investigate." Kael felt a surge of admiration for Lila's ingenuity. In her desperation, she'd found a way to turn their greatest weakness into strength, using the isolated mining camp's abandoned infrastructure to strike back at her brother. It was a brilliant move, but it also meant that the final confrontation was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. Heler began pacing the confines of the cellar like a caged animal, his mind racing through the implications and possible responses. "How long before the marshal arrives?" he demanded. 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather holds," Dr. Brennan replied. "But Vance, if he talks to the woman, if she shows him that key and the documents it opens?" Then we'd better make sure he doesn't get the chance, Heler said grimly. Gather the men, all of them. We're going up to the mountains tonight, and this time we finish it once and for all. Dr. Brennan nodded eagerly and turned to go, but Heler's voice stopped him at the foot of the stairs. And doctor, bring the dynamite. If my dear sister wants to play fortress in those mountains, then by God we'll bring the mountains down around her ears. As the two men climbed the stairs and disappeared into the mansion above, Kael was left alone with his chains and his fears. The endgame was approaching, and all the pieces were moving toward a final confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Lila and her daughters, but the future of justice in Montana territory. He tested his bonds again, feeling the wooden ring give slightly under sustained pressure. It would take time he might not have, but it was his only chance to be there when the final battle began. The long night passed, slowly marked by the gradual loosening of the wooden ring that held his chains. Kael worked methodically, using his weight and leverage to stress the old wood beyond its breaking point. His wrists were raw and bleeding by the time the ring finally gave way. But the pain was a small price to pay for freedom. He moved carefully through the darkened mansion, avoiding the guards Heler had posted, making his way toward the stables. The man's arrogance had been his downfall. So confident was he in his control over Bitterroot that he'd posted only minimal security around his own home. It was the kind of mistake that had cost many would-be conquerors their empires, the assumption that power made one invulnerable to consequence. The fastest horse in Heler's stable was a black stallion that reminded Kael of the war ponies his people had once bred. The animal accepted him without protest, sensing perhaps a kindred spirit in the exiled warrior. Within minutes, they were racing through the Montana night, following the mountain trails that would lead to the final confrontation. Dawn was breaking over the peaks when Kael reached the abandoned mining camp. Its collection of weathered buildings clustered around the entrance to what had once been a productive silver mine. Smoke rose from the chimney of the largest building, and he could see barricades thrown up at strategic points around the perimeter. Lila had chosen her fortress well. The camp commanded the high ground and had only one easily defended approach, but even as he admired her tactical sense, Kael could see the weakness in her position. The buildings were old and dry, perfect targets for the dynamite Heler was bringing. And while the narrow approach made assault difficult, it also meant there was no escape route if the defenses were breached. He approached carefully, knowing that nervous defenders might shoot first and ask questions later. "Lila," he called when he was still well outside rifle range. "It's Kael, I'm coming in." A small figure appeared at one of the windows, and Alara's voice carried clearly across the mountain air. "Uncle Kael, Mama, he's here. He got away." The title of uncle went straight to his heart, a sign of acceptance and affection from a child who had every reason to be suspicious of adults. He urged his horse forward, dismounting quickly as Lila emerged from the main building, her face showing relief mixed with apprehension. "How did you escape?" she asked, helping him with his horse as her daughters clustered around them. "When we heard the gunshots, we thought..." Heler wanted information more than he wanted revenge. Kael replied, studying their defenses and noting both strengths and weaknesses. "At least at first. But things have changed. He knows about your message to the authorities, and he's coming with enough men and explosives to finish this once and for all." Lila's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "How long do we have?" "Not long. He left last night with the dynamite and every gun he could buy or intimidate into service. They'll be here within hours." Kael moved toward the main building, his tactical mind already working on their defensive options. "Show me what you've set up." The interior of the building revealed the same ingenuity Lila had shown in contacting the authorities. She'd used mining equipment and furniture to create firing positions at the windows, with additional barricades positioned to funnel any attackers into killing zones. It was the work of someone who understood both the terrain and the nature of the threat they faced. "I found rifles in the mining office." she explained, indicating a collection of weapons that had been carefully cleaned and loaded, and enough ammunition for a sustained fight. But against dynamite, she didn't need to finish the thought. Kael studied the layout carefully, his warrior's experience suggesting modifications that would improve their chances. We need to thin their numbers before they get close enough to use the explosives effectively. And we need an escape route, something they won't expect. He moved to the back of the building, examining the entrance to the mine itself. The tunnel mouth was partially collapsed, but there was still a gap large enough for people to squeeze through. More importantly, his knowledge of mining operations suggested that there might be another way out, an emergency exit, that the original miners would have dug according to territorial safety regulations. "The mine," he said suddenly. "Has anyone explored it?" Heler stepped forward, her face bright with excitement. "I did yesterday while Mama was working on the telegraph. There's a tunnel that goes all the way through the mountain, comes out about a mile down the valley. But it's dangerous, lots of loose rock and bad air in places. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being trapped in a burning building when Heler's dynamite did its work." Kael nodded approvingly at the girl's initiative, recognizing in her the same courage and intelligence that had made her father a threat to men like Heler. The sound of distant gunfire interrupted their planning single shots that spoke of sentries engaging an approaching enemy. Heler's force had arrived, and they were probing the defenses, testing the strength of the camp's outer perimeter. "Barca positions." Kael ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief taking command of his warriors. "Remember, we're not trying to win a pitched battle. We just need to hold them off long enough for the federal marshal to arrive." But even as he spoke the words, Kael knew they might be lying to themselves. Federal marshals were few and far between in Montana territory, and Heler's influence might extend further than any of them suspected. Their real hope lay in making the cost of victory so high that even a man like Heler would think twice about paying it. The first serious attack came from the east, where the trail wound up from the valley below. Heler's men moved with the coordination of experienced fighters, using cover and suppressing fire to advance steadily toward the camp. But they were attacking uphill against prepared positions, and the defenders made them pay for every yard of ground. Kael's rifle spoke with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed and economically placed. Beside him, Lila handled her weapon, with the competence of a woman who had learned to shoot on the frontier, her bullets finding their targets with grim efficiency. Even young Heler contributed, loading weapons and spotting targets with the calm focus of someone far older than her 12 years. The attack stalled as the casualties mounted Heler's men, taking cover behind rocks and trees as they reassessed their approach. But Kael knew this was only the beginning. The real assault would come when Heler brought his explosives into play, turning their stone fortress into a death trap. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new sound reached them from the valley below. Men were hauling something heavy up the mountain trail, their progress marked by shouted orders and the scrape of metal against stone. Heler was bringing his cannon to bear, preparing to blast through defenses that rifle fire couldn't penetrate. "Not time to go," Kael said quietly, helping Lila gather her daughters for the retreat through the mine. "He's not taking any more chances. The next thing we hear will be dynamite taking this place apart." They moved quickly through the main building, gathering essential supplies and weapons for the dangerous journey ahead. The mine tunnel would be treacherous enough without the added complication of carrying everything they needed to survive in the wilderness beyond. As they reached the mine entrance, the first stick of dynamite exploded against the front wall of the building, sending shockwaves through the ground and filling the air with dust and debris. More explosions followed in rapid succession, each one bringing down another section of their carefully prepared defenses. "Move!" Kael shouted over the noise, pushing the children into the tunnel as another explosion shook the mountainside. "Stay together and keep moving no matter what happens." The tunnel was a nightmare of loose rock and stagnant air, lit only by the flickering light of a single lantern that had to last them through the entire passage. They moved in single file, Alara leading the way, with the confidence of someone who had explored this route before, followed by her younger sisters and then Lila and Kael bringing up the rear. Behind them, the explosions continued with methodical precision as Heler's men demolished the mining camp building by building. The sound echoed through the tunnel like thunder, each blast sending small avalanches of rock down from the unstable ceiling above their heads. They were perhaps halfway through the mountain when disaster struck. A particularly violent explosion closer than the others brought down a section of tunnel behind them, sealing off their retreat with tons of fallen stone. They were committed now to the uncertain path ahead, with no way back and no guarantee that the exit Alara had found would still be passable. But they pressed on through the darkness, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death and that somewhere ahead lay their only hope of safety. The tunnels seemed to stretch on forever, a nightmare passage through the bowels of the earth that tested their courage and determination with every step. When they finally emerged into the pale light of afternoon, it was like being reborn into a world of color and clean air. The exit was hidden among a cluster of boulders on the far side of the mountain, invisible from below, but offering a perfect view of the valley and the smoking ruins of what had once been their fortress. Heler's men were searching through the wreckage looking for bodies or any sign that their quarry had escaped. But the mine entrance had been completely sealed by the explosions, giving no hint of the tunnel that had carried its passengers to safety. "He'll figure it out eventually," Lila said quietly, watching her brother's men through a pair of field glasses she'd found in the mining equipment. Vance always was thorough when it came to details. When he doesn't find our bodies, he'll start looking for other explanations. Kael nodded, his own attention focused on the broader tactical situation. They'd escaped immediate death, but they were still trapped in hostile territory with limited supplies, and the knowledge that Heler would never stop hunting them. Somewhere down in the valley, a federal marshal might be riding to their rescue, but they couldn't count on outside help arriving in time to save them. "We need to keep moving," he said finally. "Put distance between us and the search parties before they expand their perimeter. There's an old trading post about 10 miles north of here, abandoned but still standing. We can rest there and decide on our next move." But as they prepared to leave their rocky sanctuary, a new sound reached them from the valley below. Riders were approaching the ruined mining camp, their horses moving at the steady pace of men who had been traveling hard for hours. Through the field glasses, Kael could make out a badge glinting on the lead rider's vest, the silver star of federal authority in Montana Territory. "The marshal." Lila whispered, her voice filled with hope and relief. "He came. He actually came." But even as they watched Heler emerge from the ruins and approach the lawman with the confident bearing of a man who had nothing to hide, the two men talked for several minutes, Heler gesturing toward the destroyed buildings and shaking his head with apparent sadness. When the conversation ended, the marshal tipped his hat politely and turned his horse back toward the valley, apparently satisfied with whatever explanation he'd been given. "What did he tell him?" Alara asked, her young voice tight with disappointment and fear. Kael lowered the field glasses, his face grim with understanding. "Probably that we were dangerous fugitives who died in the explosion when they tried to arrest us. Heler's been building his reputation as a pillar of the community for years. Against his word, who's going to believe a dead woman's accusations? The marshal's departure left them more isolated than ever, cut off from legal help and facing an enemy who controlled both the law and the lawless in Montana Territory. But it also clarified their situation in a way that eliminated false hopes and uncertain possibilities. They were on their own now, with only their wits and weapons to protect them from a man who would never stop hunting them." "The trading post," Lila said firmly, shouldering her rifle and gathering her daughters around her. "We'll make our stand there, and this time we'll be ready for him." The abandoned trading post squatted in a clearing like a wounded animal, its wooden walls scarred by weather and time, but still fundamentally sound. It had been built to withstand Indian attacks and frontier violence with thick walls and narrow windows that could serve as firing ports in a siege. More importantly, it offered multiple escape routes and defensible positions that could allow a small force to hold off a much larger one. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing their defenses using the skills and knowledge gained from their previous siege to create an even more formidable position. Kael's warrior training guided the placement of obstacles and firing positions, while Lila's frontier pragmatism ensured they had adequate supplies of food, water, and ammunition for a sustained defense. As darkness fell over the Montana mountains, they settled in to wait for the final confrontation. Somewhere out there in the night, Heler was gathering his forces for one last assault, driven by the knowledge that failure now would mean his exposure and ruin. The stakes had been raised beyond simple revenge or greed. This had become a battle for survival in its most basic form. The attack came just before dawn, announced by the thunder of horses and the war cries of men who had been promised rich rewards for the deaths of their quarry. But Heler had underestimated the strength of their new position and the determination of people who had nothing left to lose. The first wave of attackers broke against their defenses like water against stone, leaving dead and wounded scattered across the clearing. As the sun climbed higher, the pattern repeated itself with variations. Heler's men tried different approaches, different tactics, but each assault ended the same way, with retreat and casualties that steadily reduced their numbers. The trading post had become a fortress that devoured attackers, and even Heler's gold couldn't buy men willing to throw their lives away indefinitely. But Kael knew that desperation would eventually drive their enemy to more extreme measures. When conventional tactics failed, men like Heler turned to fire and explosives to wholesale destruction that cared nothing for the cost in innocent lives. The question was whether their defenses could hold long enough for Heler to make a fatal mistake to overreach, in a way that would finally expose him to the justice he'd evaded for so long. The answer came in the form of a white flag, carried by Dr. Brennan, who approached the trading post under a truce to deliver his master's ultimatum. The doctor looked haggard and desperate, his medical bag replaced by a rifle, and his civilized facade cracked by the violence he'd witnessed and participated in. "Mrs. Brennan," he called from beyond rifle range. "Mr. Heler wishes to speak with you. He's prepared to offer terms for surrender, generous terms that would spare your children's lives." Lila appeared at one of the windows, her rifle trained on the man who had betrayed her family. "What terms, Doctor? What lies? Is my brother prepared to tell now? He wants the key." Dr. Brennan replied, his voice carrying across the clearing with desperate urgency. "Give him the key to your husband's safe, and he'll let you and the children go free. You have his word." The laugh that escaped Lila's lips was bitter as winter wind. "His word. The word of a man who murdered my husband and tortured Kael's mother. Forgive me if I find his promises somewhat lacking in credibility." But even as she spoke, Kael could see the calculation in her eyes, the mother's desperate weighing of any option that might save her children. It was exactly the kind of hope that men like Heler exploited the willingness of good people to believe, that evil might sometimes keep its word. "Don't," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her at the window. "He'll kill us all the moment he has what he wants. Our only chance is to make him come to us, to force him into a mistake that exposes his true nature." Dr. Brennan was still waiting for an answer, his position under the white flag, making him safe from direct attack, but not from the growing tension that filled the air, like the pressure before a storm. Behind him, barely visible among the trees, Kael could see the shapes of Heler's remaining men, their weapons ready, and their patience wearing thin. "Tell my brother," Lila called finally, "that if he wants the key, he can come and take it himself. No more hiding behind hired guns and false witnesses. Let him show the courage to face his victims directly." Dr. Brennan nodded unhappily and turned to carry the message back to his master. But he'd taken only a few steps when Heler himself emerged from the tree line, his tall figure unmistakable, even at a distance. He walked with the confident stride of a man who believed himself invulnerable, surrounded by enough firepower to level the trading post and everyone in it. "Sister dear." He called, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman. Such dramatic, such unnecessary violence. All of this could have been avoided if you'd simply been reasonable from the beginning. Kael studied the man's approach, noting the way his remaining followers spread out to surround the building. This wasn't a parley. It was the prelude to a final assault designed to get Heler close enough to use the dynamite he undoubtedly carried. The time for negotiation had passed, replaced by the brutal mathematics of survival. "Close enough," Kael called when Heler reached the edge of the clearing. "Say what you came to say, but don't think we'll let you get any closer." Heler smiled, the expression holding all the warmth of a winter grave. "Ah, the noble savage speaks. How touching to see you still trying to protect your adopted family. But I'm afraid this is where your particular story ends, Chief. You see, I've grown tired of games, tired of chasing shadows through these mountains. It's time to finish what should have been completed years ago." His hand moved to his coat, revealing not a weapon, but several sticks of dynamite bound together with wire. The fuses were already lit, their sparks bright in the morning sunlight, as they burned steadily toward the explosive charges. Heler's message was clear: surrender now, or watch the trading post become their tomb. 10 seconds, he announced conversationally. "Give me the key, and I'll throw this harmlessly into the woods. Refuse, and we'll see how well that old building stands up to modern explosives." But Kael was already moving, his warrior reflexes driving him out through the trading post's back door, even as Heler raised the bundled dynamite. The man had made his fatal mistake, coming close enough to be reached by someone willing to sacrifice everything for the lives of innocent children. Heler saw him coming and tried to throw the dynamite, but Kael's tackle sent them both sprawling to the ground, the explosive bundle flying wide of its intended target. They rolled in the dirt, each man fighting for advantage with the desperate fury of someone who knew that losing meant death. Heler was younger and better fed, but Kael had the advantages of experience and righteous anger. His knife found its way into his hand with fluid grace, its blade seeking the soft spots between his opponent's ribs. But Heler had his own weapons, including a derringer that appeared in his palm like a deadly magic trick. The gun cracked like a whip, its bullet burning a line across Kael's shoulder and spinning him away from his target. Heler rolled to his feet with surprising agility, the derringer swinging to track his opponent for a killing shot. But before he could fire again, a rifle bullet from the trading post windows took him high in the chest, the impact staggering him backward toward the trees. Blood was spreading across Heler's expensive shirt. But the wound wasn't immediately fatal. He retreated toward his men, his face twisted with rage and the knowledge that his carefully laid plans were collapsing around him. "Kill them all," he screamed, his voice cracking with pain and fury. "Burn it down. I want them to die screaming." The final battle erupted with the violence of a summer thunderstorm, gunfire crackling from the trees as Heler's remaining men tried to overwhelm the trading post's defenses. But their leader's wound had shaken their confidence, and their attacks lacked the coordination and fury of earlier assaults. From his position in the clearing, Kael added his own fire to the defense, his rifle speaking with the precision of a man who had learned to shoot when ammunition was precious and every shot had to count. Around him, the dynamite Heler had dropped lay smoking in the dirt, its fuses burned down almost to the charges themselves. Without thinking, Kael grabbed the bundle and hurled it toward the largest concentration of attackers. The explosion, when it came, was tremendous, shaking the ground and filling the air with dirt and debris. When the smoke cleared, the attack had broken entirely, Heler's surviving men fleeing back toward the valley, with their wounded leader supported between two of his most loyal followers. Silence settled over the clearing like dust after a windstorm, broken only by the distant sound of retreating horses and the crackle of small fires started by the explosion. From the trading post, Lila emerged with her daughters, their faces showing the strain of battle, but their eyes bright with the knowledge of victory. "Is it over?" Little Wren asked, her small hand finding Kael's as they stood together in the morning sunlight. "Are the bad men gone?" Kael looked down at the child who had come to mean so much to him. This little girl who called him uncle and trusted him to keep her safe from the monsters that stalked the world. "They're gone," he said simply. "And they won't be coming back." But even as he spoke the words, Kael knew that their troubles weren't entirely over. Heler might be wounded and defeated, but he was still alive, still dangerous, still capable of causing harm from whatever hole he chose to hide in. The key to Thomas Brennan's safe remained in Lila's possession, its secrets waiting to be revealed to a world that might finally be ready to listen. 3 days later, a different federal marshal arrived at the trading post, this one accompanied by a company of cavalry and carrying orders that bore the seal of the territorial governor himself. Marshal James Harrison was a different breed of lawman than his predecessor, a man whose reputation for honesty and competence had earned him assignments to the most difficult cases in Montana Territory. "Mrs. Brennan," he said formally, removing his hat as he approached the small group gathered outside the trading post. "I'm here about your allegations against Vance Heler and the circumstances surrounding your husband's death. I understand you have evidence that might shed new light on these matters." Lila produced the brass key from her bodice, its surface catching the afternoon sunlight as she held it out for the marshal's inspection. "This opens my husband's private safe in Billings. Inside, you'll find survey maps and documents that prove the railroad company's fraud, as well as evidence of the mineral deposits they claimed didn't exist." Marshal Harrison examined the key carefully before returning it to Lila's keeping. "And you're prepared to testify that Vance Heler was responsible for your husband's death and the destruction of these documents?" "I am," Lila replied firmly. "And I have witnesses who can corroborate my testimony." She gestured toward Kael, who stood beside her with the quiet dignity of a man who had found his purpose in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The marshal's attention turned to the Shoshone warrior, his expression respectful but cautious. "Mr. the Windwalker," Kael supplied. "Kael Windwalker. And yes, I'll testify about what I witnessed and what Heler told me about his crimes." This could be dangerous. Marshal Harrison warned them both. Heler still has friends in high places, people who benefit from the current arrangement of things. Testifying against him will make you targets for retaliation. Lila looked at her daughters, all 4 of them, standing strong and determined despite everything they'd endured. "We've been targets already, Marshal. At least this way we have a chance to see justice done." The trial of Vance Heler became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Montana Territory's short history. The courtroom in Billings was packed every day, with spectators drawn by the promise of revelations about corruption and murder in high places. Newspapers from as far away as San Francisco sent reporters to cover the story of the Shoshone warrior and the widow who had brought down one of the territory's most powerful men. Lila's testimony was devastating in its detail and emotional impact. She spoke of her husband's discoveries of Heler's threats and of the night her world burned down around her. The key opened exactly what she had promised, revealing documents that exposed a web of fraud and corruption stretching from local officials to territorial authorities. Kael's testimony was equally damaging, his quiet dignity and obvious integrity making his words carry weight with the jury. He spoke of Heler's confessions about murdering Standing Bear Woman, about the torture and cruelty that had driven the Shoshone from their ancestral lands. By the time he finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even Dr. Brennan, faced with overwhelming evidence and the promise of leniency in exchange for cooperation, turned state's evidence against his former employer. His testimony filled in the gaps in the prosecution's case, providing the medical and technical details that proved Thomas Brennan's murder had been carefully planned and executed. When the verdict came, it was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts from murder to fraud to conspiracy against the territorial government. The judge, a man whose own integrity had been questioned by some of Heler's supporters, delivered a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime's death by hanging to be carried out within 30 days. But Vance Heler would never face the hangman's noose. On the night before his scheduled execution, he was found dead in his cell, apparently having taken poison smuggled in by a visitor. Even in death, he'd managed to cheat justice of its final satisfaction, denying his victims the closure they deserved. The revelation of Heler's crimes sent shockwaves through Montana Territory's power structure. Officials resigned in disgrace, railroad executives fled to avoid prosecution, and land claims were overturned by the dozens as the true extent of the fraud became clear. The Shoshone, led by Kael's cousin Black Elk, were granted formal recognition of their rights to the Bitterroot Valley, along with substantial compensation for the years of illegal exile. For Kael himself, the vindication brought a bittersweet satisfaction. His mother's murder had been acknowledged and avenged, his people's suffering recognized and addressed. But he found that his thoughts turned less to the past than to the future, to the family that had adopted him as surely as he had adopted them. Lila used her husband's mineral claims and the compensation from the territorial government to purchase a small ranch on the outskirts of Billings, a place where her daughters could grow up in safety and security. Kael found himself welcomed not just as a protector, but as a father figure, the girls having lost one father to violence, but gained another through courage and love. The wedding was a small affair, attended by Marshal Harrison and a few other friends they'd made during the long struggle for justice. Kael wore traditional Shoshone ceremony clothes, while Lila chose a simple dress that spoke of new beginnings rather than past sorrows. The ceremony itself blended traditions from both cultures, a symbol of the unity they'd forged in the crucible of shared danger. As the years passed, their ranch became a gathering place for those who sought justice and understanding in a territory still struggling to define itself. Kael trained young men in the warrior's code of protecting the innocent, while Lila used her knowledge of herbs and healing to tend to anyone who needed help regardless of their race or background. Heler grew into a strong young woman whose intelligence and determination reminded everyone of her father, while her younger sisters developed their own unique strengths and interests. All four girls considered Kael their father in every way that mattered, and he loved them with a fierce protectiveness that had been forged in fire and tested by time. On quiet evenings when the work was done, and the family gathered around their fireplace, Kael would sometimes take out a small leather pouch and show his daughters the eagle feather that marked his warrior status. It had been given to him by his mother years ago, along with a promise that as long as he protected the innocent, he would never truly be alone. Wren, now a young woman of 16 with her mother's auburn hair and her father's thoughtful eyes, held the feather carefully as Kael told the story once again. "You kept your promise, Papa," she said softly, using the name that had long since replaced more formal titles. "You protected us, and in doing so you found your way home." Kael smiled as he looked around at his family, at the life they'd built together from the ashes of tragedy and loss. "Home isn't a place," he said, the words carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned their meaning the hard way. "It's the people you choose to love and protect. And I couldn't have asked for a better home than this." Outside their ranch house, the Montana wind carried the scent of sage and growing things of a land healing from old wounds and learning to embrace new possibilities. In the distance, an eagle circled high above the mountains, its cry echoing across the valley like a song of freedom and hope. The Wild West was changing, becoming something different than it had been, and people like Kael Windwalker and his chosen family were leading that change, one act of courage and love at a time.